Bernières-sur-Mer is a quiet town along the Normandy coast. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, it was the scene of heavy combat. It was designated as Nan White of Juno Beach, the landing zone of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. The sea was rough, the men were nervous, yet morale was high. History was in the making. After a quick breakfast, the men of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada boarded their landing craft assault or LCAs. Leading the rifles of Lieutenant Colonel John Godfrey Sprague into France were A and B Company. A Company under the command of Major Hume Elliot Dalton would land just to the northwest of the village, while B Company of Charles Osborne Dalton, Hume Elliot's brother, would land opposite the village itself. As the Canadians neared their objective at 7:30 am, shells whizzed overhead, pummeling the German coastal defences. HL was set at 7:45 am, but it would be delayed by some 10 minutes. The sea had become so rough that the DD or duplex drive Sherman tanks of B Squadron, Fort Garry Horse, was ordered to land ashore instead of swimming ashore themselves. This left A and B Company without armour support. Bernières-sur-Mer became an infantry job. Finally, after bobbing around that sea for a few moments, the green light was given at 8:05 am to advance. The supporting fire slackened apart from an occasional shell. The assault crafts drove the final meters before touching down at 8:12 am. In front of the men of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada were the Germans of the 5th Company Infantry Regiment 736. They were well dug in the Atlantic Wall defences of WN-28, WN standing for Widerstandsnest or Strong Point. Due to the rapidly rising tide, several assault crafts hit mines. Fortunately for the attacking Canadians, only slight casualties were incurred. The men of the Queen's Own Rifles had to cross 200 yards of beach before coming up to the sea wall. The German 5th Company rapidly opened fire, but A Company of Major Elliot Dalton on the right was quick to cross the beach. They rapidly reached the sea wall and the adjacent railway line. The railway station itself acted as the company boundary. The platoon on the extreme right flank of A Company lost over half of its men as it landed in front of a heavy anti-tank gun. Lieutenant Ray was wounded and Lance Sergeant Simpson was killed. As the men fell wounded or were killed, Sergeant William Smith, who was wounded himself, took charge of the depleted platoon. He managed to overcome a strongly defended position and led his men to the railway station at Bernières, where he collapsed. The command of the platoon shifted to a corporal, but thanks to Sergeant Smith's audacity, the platoon had finally managed to cross the beach. Smith would be awarded with the military medal for his action on D-Day morning. Over on the left flank, B Company of Major Charles Dalton was also faced with murderous machine gun and mortar fire. They landed right in front of several WN-28 pillboxes and men were killed or wounded as soon as the ramps of the assault crafts lowered. Almost half of B Company had become casualties in crossing the 200 yards of beach. Lieutenant W.G. Herbert dashed forward, together with Corporal Tessier and Rifleman Tchaikovsky. Armed with Sten guns and grenades, the three-man party silenced several pillboxes, preventing more casualties. By that time, however, Major Charles Dalton had been wounded in the head. Nonetheless, he continued to lead his men while taking one of the pillboxes. Due to the severity of the wound, Major Charles Dalton was unable to proceed the fight. False rumours spread to his brother that he was killed. Nonetheless, Elliot Dalton had to fight on. In the rush up the beach, Lieutenants McLean and Herbert had been wounded along with their commander. Sergeant Harris and Morrison were less fortunate as they lost their lives on Nan White. Lieutenant Henry Elliot temporarily took over the command until Captain Mills also landed ashore. Elliot's platoon had landed ashore too far to the east. However, they landed without opposition and were able to flank the Germans inside Bernières-sur-Mer itself. This caused the Germans to believe that the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada had gotten round their flank, and the 5th Company Infantry Regiment 736 started to abandon its positions. By that time, B Company had almost entirely been wiped out. Fortunately for the Canadians, reinforcements arrived in the form of C and D companies led by Majors Nixon and Gordon respectively. Also, the Sherman tanks arrived as B Squadron of the Fort Garry Horse gently touched down on the wet sand. With armour support, the Queen's Own Rifles rapidly pushed inside the town, and the first objective of Bernières-sur-Mer fell into Canadian hands. Exits were created and the remnants of Companies A and B started mopping up the town. Companies C and D rapidly pushed on towards Bernières-sur-Mer, Colombey-sur-Thaon and the important height at Angerny. Bernières was clear of German resistance by 9 am, by which time A Company pressed on in the trail of C and D companies to act as a local reserve. B Company, which also suffered the most during the initial landing, was held back at Bernières until the afternoon. With the village safely in Canadian hands, the reserve battalion of the 8th Canadian Brigade, the Régiment de la Chaudière, also landed ashore. It took the Canadians the majority of the afternoon to reach the heights at Angerny. By the end of the day, the battalion had reached its D-Day objectives. The coastal town of Bernières-sur-Mer had been cleared of Germans, and many prisoners were rounded up on the beach. They then pushed inland to reach the heights at Angerny, increasing the Juno Beach beachhead. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada had suffered the heaviest casualties of all Canadian units on D-Day. With 61 other ranks killed in action, 6 officers and 69 other ranks wounded, the regiment had had a tough day on a cold Juno Beach on D-Day morning. Lieutenant Herbert received the Military Cross for taking out several pillboxes in front of B Company. Corporal Tessier and Rifleman Tchaikovsky would be awarded with the Military Medal for the same action. Sergeant William Smith also received a military medal. He deservedly received his award for taking charge of the men and overcoming a strong point and subsequently leading his men into Bernières itself, before finally collapsing as a result of severe blood loss. Major Charles Osborne Dalton, commanding officer of B Company, and one of the Dalton brothers, received a Distinguished Service Order for his outstanding leadership that morning. As Major Charles Dalton was evacuated with a serious head wound, false rumours spread to his brother Elliot that he was killed in action. While working through his sorrow, Elliot fought on. Eventually he too was wounded and evacuated back to England, where a recovering Major Charles Dalton was waiting for him. As one can imagine, it was a most splendid reunion considering the circumstances. This was the Ace Destroyer. I hope you enjoyed this video about the Normandy landings. If you did, why not subscribe or leave a comment if you haven't already, and I hope to catch you in another video. Cheers!